Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we are welcoming back Shirag Shemmassian to talk about the LSAT and law school admissions. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Before we dive into this episode, I wanted to set the stage for this interview. Since we recorded this episode, our lives have ever been changed and turned upside down with the onset of COVID-19. As of April 22nd, 2020, the April LSAT has been postponed, and the LSAC will be offering an online version of the LSAT in May. This is likely not the last of the changes we will see with the LSAT as time marches on and our new reality sets in. If you are considering sitting for the LSAT in 2020 or even 2021, I would encourage you to frequently check lsac.org for more updates on their COVID-19 and LSAT Flex information pages. The advice on this podcast should still be helpful, but it will not reflect any realities of the at-home testing options or COVID-19. We hope you still enjoy this episode and are staying well and hanging in there. And now, on to today's interview. Welcome back. Today, we are welcoming back to the podcast Shirag Shemmassian, and we are going to talk about the LSAT and choosing the right law school for you. So thanks for coming back to the podcast. I love repeat takers of our offer to join us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. I was on the hot seat last time. It wasn't too hot, so I figured why not return?
Excellent. Well, I know we have another podcast that I really enjoyed doing a while back on choosing the right law school for you, which we will actually link to in the show notes if people haven't heard it. But if folks haven't kind of heard about you and what you do before, why don't you give us a little bit more about yourself and your business and how you help people looking to enter law school?
Yeah, so we do everything on the admissions side. So we help students figure out what narrative to communicate across their application materials. So brainstorming the right topics, outlining their essays, and editing them until they're perfect. Helping students figure out what schools to apply to if there are interviews involved, doing that. Editing CVs, basically everything around the application process. And even before then, advising folks on what extracurriculars to pursue, what courses they might want to take, what internships they might want to get involved in, really everything involved in the admissions process outside of the LSAT, which one day we might take on, but at the time we focus on applications.
Great. Well, the LSAT, unfortunately, is a big part of that law school application. Now, it used to be that you had to take the LSAT back in the dark ages. When I applied to law school, you had to take the LSAT. But things are kind of shifting in that space because now some schools are starting to accept the GRE. So how is kind of the power of the LSAT changing, or how it has kind of law school admissions started to change recently?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've been getting this question more and more lately. So to back up for a moment, so what's covered on the GRE, right? So it's basically half verbal,
right,
and half quant. So it's math and verbal,
right.
And
I took that even years before the LSAT. So that's the dark ages.
yes. GRE has been around for quite a long time, and then it's been increasingly accepted by law schools. Now, just off the top, I should say, every law school accepts the LSAT. Not every law school accepts the GRE.
Got it.
Right? So when you're thinking about GRE versus LSAT, one big question is how wide of a net do I want to be able to cast, right? That's super important because let's say you want to apply to a certain 10 schools. But then 6 of those accept the LSAT but not the GRE. Then you have to ask yourself, well, how badly do I want to apply to the 4 that don't accept the GRE, right? So you want to consider the types of schools you want to apply to before making a decision on whether to take the GRE in lieu of the LSAT.
What if somebody has already taken the GRE? So maybe, I think I was kind of in that camp of somebody who was not sure exactly what I was going to do. So I initially thought I might go do a PhD in something. Yeah. And so I went and took the GRE. Then I decided I didn't want that PhD. And then at that time, you just had to go take the LSAT if you wanted to apply to law school. So if somebody already has that GRE, should they still sit for the LSAT?
Maybe yes, maybe no.
Okay.
There are a few factors to consider. Number one is, let's assume for a moment the GRE score has not expired, right? Okay. So, because some schools are going to have expiration dates, 3 years, whatever the case might be. So let's assume that you took it in the last year. It's still, you're still eligible to use that score. Now the question is, should I also take the LSAT in addition to the GRE?
Right.
So let's assume for a moment that all of the schools on your list accept the GRE and the LSAT, right? Mm-hmm. So we don't have this issue I mentioned earlier about some of the schools not accepting the GRE. I got this question recently from someone who went to an engineering program and I think had like a 3.4 GPA, which is obviously engineering is really tough. But then had a 97th percentile score on the verbal section on the GRE, but a 99th percentile score on the quant.
So just terribly bombed it terribly.
Yeah. I'd done really, really well on the GRE, and they asked me, hey, should I also take the LSAT? So of course I brought up the issue about, well, we want to make sure that every school on your list accepts the GRE. But I said beyond that, I actually don't think you should take the LSAT because you're playing to your strengths, right? So if you think about the LSAT doesn't include quant. So if that student is really strong in quant, well, they're going to achieve, they've achieved a really great score. By taking the LSAT, you might be introducing risk, right? Because let's say you get a score that's at the 90th percentile. It's good, but it's not great like your GRE scores. And now you have to, then you can make a decision on, okay, well, these schools that accept the GRE, maybe I send them the GRE score. The schools that only accept the LSAT, then, I can send them that LSAT score. But by playing to your strengths, you can maximize your chances. Because law schools, the question any school is trying to answer with a standardized test is, okay, we have students from different programs with different majors, with different experiences. How can we put them on some sort of level playing field? That's what standardized tests do. Whether you do exceptionally well on the GRE or exceptionally well on the LSAT score, the question we're trying to answer is, are you among the academic elite when we offer a level playing field? And if I can answer that question with a yes, whether through the GRE or the LSAT, I've done my job.
Got it.
The schools wouldn't allow the GRE if they were going to, I guess, think it was less valuable than the LSAT. They've come to the decision that, look, these are both answering the question we really want answered. So you decide, but do great.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's really interesting. So, like most things, we can always give the lawyer answer, which is, it depends.
Yeah.
But it sounds like if you are thinking about going to law school and you already have a rock star GRE score, that you can consider moving forward with just that, rather than put yourself through the LSAT. If it reflects really well on you. But if it's a okay GRE score, then it sounds like it's time to go ahead and try and do the LSAT to see if you can get a more impressive score.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing too is, and then you can decide what you want to do. You build in flexibility. But if I've done really, really well with the GRE and all the schools on my list, or most of them except the GRE, then I might not need to.
Got it.
Right? So it's a question of weighing, like, what's my score with which schools do I want to apply to?
And maybe timeline, depending on, when you have the opportunity to sit for the LSAT.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And so assuming, logistically things are there, then it comes down to that, what your score was and the personal decision with school list.
So it seems to ebb and flow. We had a drop in law school admission numbers, kind of and then things ticked up again, especially after 2016. So what now is considered a good LSAT number? Like an LSAT number that you're like, I knocked it out of the park. I feel good. Yeah. I'm going to get into the schools that I want.
Yes. So, it's no secret that we have a lot of law schools in this country.
Right.
Right. So, if overall numbers drop with regard to law school applications, it doesn't mean that the top schools now have lower expectations.
Got it.
Right. So even if overall law school application numbers drop, it's not like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Columbia, NYU, and so on now become less desirable.
Right, those top 14.
Yeah. Like, T14 schools are going to be really coveted no matter what, economic times we're in or whatever the case might be. So the top schools will always have top expectations. Mm-hmm. So what was necessary, before the application drop is necessary now. So
got it.
I would say a good LSAT score for the T14, it's going to be a 168 plus. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're thinking like, top 6, if we want to narrow in even more, like the schools I specifically mentioned, like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Columbia, NYU, et cetera. Right. Now you're gonna have to do a 170 plus to be at that 50th percentile or above, really. Mm-hmm. And then if you want to be 75th percentile and up, depending on the specific school, you want to do 172 plus.
So it seems like one of the things that's different with the application numbers, when I applied to law school, the admissions numbers were insane. And so one of the problems that a lot of the big schools were having is they had so many people with those LSAT scores that they could toss all the files on the floor, pick up a handful of them, and they were all qualified. It was, and so even when it sounds like that there are less applications, maybe there are just less qualified applications, but there's still more qualified applications than there are spots.
Exactly. And the top schools have tremendous power where they can essentially, blindly throw darts, and, they a lot of admissions committees at top schools joke, and we can fill our class entirely from the pool of rejected students and still have a great class. So they are spoiled for choice.
Right.
And so they get to look at everyone's applications and say, all right, we want people with high stats and who have excellent experiences and who have excellent, essays and stuff like that. They don't have to come to any compromises. Got
it. That's a good point. Whereas as you get lower in the rankings, that seems to be where these admissions numbers really change things.
Exactly. Because, law is not worried about its yield.
Right. It's true.
And so you're just playing in a different sandbox when we talk about like T6 or T14 types of schools.
Right.
And so, and then, along with that, though, to your point, Lee, like a lot of these applicants at top schools have top scores. Mm-hmm. And there are a number of students with top numbers who aren't getting into these schools. So a strong GPA and a strong LSAT score are necessary, but not sufficient.
Got it. Yeah. And then the thing that can happen is if you move down a tier, let's say you didn't get into those top schools, but you have those high scores, that can make you a great candidate for things like scholarships. And, there can be other benefits to you
exactly
that come. Having those scores in that solid application, behooves you, even if you aren't accepted into those, the rarefied air at the top.
Exactly. It's like the big fish in a small pond type of thing. A less prestigious school will want to more aggressively recruit a top candidate because that will bring, prestige to their name as well. Right. So I think, achieving a strong LSAT score is great for getting into top programs, but also improving your odds of getting great scholarships. That's an awesome point.
Yeah. All right. So, one of the things that we're seeing in the law school, but mostly the bar space, is that a lot of people are kind of working while trying to prepare for the bar exam. And I know when I prepared for the LSAT, I had a full-time job. I actually, this is kind of funny about me deciding to take the LSAT, is I went through a really bad breakup. And then I decided I needed to figure out what I was going to do next in my life. So for some reason, I decided that going and doing a lot of yoga and studying for the LSAT was how I was going to cope. It was I don't know why that decided the perfect combo for me. But So I was very zen, in good shape, and then would study for the LSAT in my free time. But I also didn't have a lot to do outside of work. So I pretty much like worked, studied, and went to yoga. So, I think for a lot of people, though, when you're trying to make this transition, it can be hard, depending on your work-life balance, to study for this test, because it is something that needs to be studied for most people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. And so do you think that you're seeing more and more students who are trying to balance working and these applications, or has that pretty much been the norm for folks applying to law school?
In terms of pushing really hard to do well on the LSAT? Or?
Right. Because I think in an ideal, it used to be that a lot of people would take the LSAT maybe in law school, or they would not have very serious jobs that they were trying to study. But I think that especially as everyone's feeling the money crunch, it can be hard to take time off to study or, study when you're not doing something else.
Yeah, for sure. There are always going to be individual differences, right? And circumstances we have to consider. It's one thing if, you come from a family with means or something like that, and you have the luxury of not having to work, and you get to just study full time, and that's what you're doing for a 2-3 month period, versus working as a paralegal and simultaneously having to work. In those cases, I don't encourage students just to do your best. It's okay if you don't have as strong a score or something like that, but to spread the work out. Okay?
Yeah.
Let's say it's ideal, hypothetically speaking, let's say that it's ideal to study for 2 to 3 months based on your natural abilities with logic, but also how good you are at standardized tests and whatever the case might be. But now you're working a very rigorous job. You're working 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week, and you simply don't have the same bandwidth. Well, then maybe you stretch the 2 to 3 month study period to 4 to 5 months, and you do it more in smaller chunks, but over a larger period of time, so that your overall study time, it ends up being the same, and you're not sacrificing your numbers because of this truncated time frame.
And I would assume, just like in kind of the bar space, if you do have a high intensity job, or let's say you have a lot of family responsibilities, or, your time is very precious, as all of our time is precious, but your time is very small and precious. That could be where you may want to look at getting a specific LSAT tutor who can customize your work to what you're doing, because oftentimes the larger review programs aren't going to reflect these very unique situations, especially if people who are working a lot of hours.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And so you have to think about it based on your situation.
Yeah.
I never make blanket statements about, what you need for the LSAT is X amount of months or something like that. Or even, for the bar exam, I'm sure, lawyers would say something similar. It's about how much time do you have right now and how many total hours do you need to put into this? And then let's essentially work backward. What's the date? When do I need to start by? So that I can put enough time to achieve what I need to.
And I think what's really hard, I know for our bar takers, and I think it's for anybody, is to be realistic about what that time is. Because sometimes I have a lot of conversations with people about balancing working and studying for tests. And I'll say how many hours do you have? And they'll be like, oh, I could totally do 35 hours. And I'm like, oh, really? Where are those 35 hours coming from? You just told me you have a baby at home and you have a full-time job. When are you going to study those 35? And then it's they start to parse it out, and then it starts to get, very realistic that that's not possible. And so I do think that one of the challenges for everybody is to be super conservative and realistic, and also realize that stuff happens. You get the flu and you're out for a week. You can't let that bring you down from, your whole studying. Right.
It's a marathon.
Yeah.
To use the cliche, it's a marathon. And so just have the long-term game in mind.
Yeah.
The long game in mind, and consider, okay, what do I need to do? Will there be dips? Will there be, ebbs and flows and things like that. Absolutely. You might be thinking, all right, I'm on this timeline, and my practice test scores are going to increase in this linear fashion. And then all of a sudden you take one and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't do as well as I need to, and I'm 3 weeks out and stuff like that. So that's okay. Like, just build in, that time and that whatever you need to be resilient, not only throughout your study process, but for the actual exam.
Yeah. And life doesn't stop because we've signed up for these tests.
That's right.
Even though we might wish that we had that power, stuff happens. So
that's a very Zen. That's a very Zen response, Lee.
Well, it maybe is the lesson life keeps telling me, teaching me over and over again. All right. So what about the situation where you've studied, you've prepared, you found a preparation program that felt good to you, you did all this work, you sit for the test, and it doesn't go well? Then what do you do? Do you just throw up your hands and say, I shouldn't go to law school? Or what are the different ways that you can approach kind of disappointing LSAT scores?
Yeah. So the numbers really, so numbers are very important for law school admissions. But what that really impacts is your school list. You might have thought, okay, if I achieve X score, then, schools A, B, and C would be targets for me. But then you underperformed your expectations. Well, then maybe those schools now are reaches, right? So now you need to identify new targets. That's one way to do it, to adjust your school list. Or if you say, look, no, I'm dead set on getting into schools in this tier, then you have to figure out, like, okay, when do I intend to apply and when can I retake the exam? Okay, I have identified a date I can retake the exam. Do I have enough time to study to make a retake worthwhile? Because you don't want to just like get the same score or less, you didn't have time to study. So depending on when the application, like when you have to submit your applications and how far you're out and what test dates are available to you, that's how you would approach the decision. Either adjust your school list or, retake the exam, or both.
Yeah. And do you find that if people have a lot of flexibility in when they want to take the test, I think it used to be that you always wanted to try and take the October test for if you were going to apply for the next fall. Do you still find that, that is true? If somebody has a history of struggling with tests and standardized tests are their strength, do they want to try and start the process earlier to give them more opportunities to retake?
Yeah, absolutely. If standardized tests are a struggle for you, don't take your first test or the one like you're really relying on right before you need to apply, right? Because what happens if you take the exam and then you don't do as well as possible, and law school operates on a rolling admissions process and you need to retake the exam and you need, 2 months to achieve the score that you need to. Well, now we're in the new year,
right?
And now admissions is, it's a runaway train. Whether it's going to move whether or not you're aboard, and so you have to think about this stuff ahead of time, versus getting into a situation where you're essentially being squeezed.
Also, if you are a person that is struggling with the LSAT, do you think there's ever a point where you say, I'm going to pause this and then go back to the GRE, if you've never taken the GRE, and try something new to see if that, applies to your strengths? Because maybe you do better on math than you do on logic games.
Yeah, exactly. And again, because essentially they're seen as equivalent if you do similarly well, then you get to you can choose whatever you want folks to see, right? And so, and again, math has logic to it, of course, the same way that there are verbal logic games and things like that. So if that's a better format for you, do that.
Yeah.
And GRE is also there are so many more. I mean, you could take it like any time.
Right.
Which has limited dates.
Right. I mean, that's the benefit. You don't have to wait until the next LSAT date. I think if you're trying to hedge your bets, it gives you lots more opportunities.
Yeah, tons. Like, between June 2020 and April 2021, there are, I think, 8 LSAT dates.
Right.
Versus GRE, you show up at a testing center.
Every weekend, basically. I mean, it's
happens all the time. So, yeah.
So, if you are somebody who's deciding to go to law school, I think trying to decide this path of like how to do these admissions tests, it seems like one of the things you really want to think about is your academic success on the SAT and getting into college. Do you think those tests can inform how you're going to do on these other standardized tests?
Yeah, I think they're, I'd have to look at, recent studies that, showed correlations between SAT and ACT tests and LSAT scores and stuff. But that trend always comes up.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say always, but, it often comes up. And so I think that is a good indicator for how long you should be studying, right? So if you know that you struggle on standardized tests and maybe you struggled with the SAT or the ACT, well, you might be the type of person who needs a little bit more time.
Right.
Or conversely, if you had a 1550 on the SAT and, you feel good about this sort of thing, you might need less time. You work quickly, you process information quickly and all that kind of stuff, then you might not need the same thing. So it's good to take an early diagnostic, okay? Because it's nice to know, as a rule of thumb, hey, if you did well on the SAT, you have maybe a higher ceiling on the LSAT, that's fine, but there's no substitute for taking a really great early diagnostic.
Yeah.
And early diagnostics, I mean, for better or worse, they tend to be very tough, right? Because, testing companies and stuff like that want you to be like, oh my gosh, I really need study materials.
Right. I really need to sign up for this course. Extra tutoring.
Yeah. Right. So take those. It's okay to be a little bit spooked in the beginning because that's going to be a big motivator for you.
And I think the one thing that, we are very passionate about in law school and for the bar exam, and I think the same is true for these admissions tests, is you can study to become better at them. There are the people who find these tests infuriatingly simple, but, they are the outliers. I think most of us end up needing to do some sort of preparation for it. And that doesn't mean that you're not qualified for school. That is just what needs to be done. Just like most of us won't pass the driver's test if we don't study for the driver's test.
Yeah, exactly. And, standardized test prep, you're right, Lee, it's just the norm.
Yeah.
It's just a thing you do. I would be shocked, honestly, these days if I speak with a student who said, yeah, I'm taking the LSAT and not prepping.
Right.
Like they're the outlier.
Right.
Study. So I strongly advise students to study and to study hard and to study deliberately. And because these are, they're not just tests of natural ability or talent or anything like that. They're obviously very teachable and they require skill. And skill is something that you develop through deliberate practice.
Right. So there could be a whole nother discussion about the validity of these tests as deciding whether or not you should go to law school. But since they are being used as a point of admission, if you really do incredibly poorly and you are not likely to get into, schools that are maybe even accredited by the ABA, or you're in a situation where you're really in kind of a danger zone. They have done all these studies that show that LSAT scores do somewhat correlate to success in law school, that grades and LSAT scores can tend to correlate. And so at what point do you think folks, should really sit back and decide if this is the right path? Do they just keep taking the test until they can get into a better school? Or is there a point where, having a positive mindset means that you're going down a path that maybe isn't a good fit for you?
Yeah. I mean, it's a question of like, how bad do you want it and what is it going to take to get there?
Yeah.
Right. If you're really, really set on becoming an attorney and, that's your dream career and stuff like that, well, then, do what you need to do.
Right.
Now, if you keep taking it and retaking it and you're just really not doing well, then you have to ask yourself, like, okay, is this like a study approach issue? Is it an ability issue, or whatever the case might be? And then also to consider, along with that, alternative options, whatever it is that you're interested, either in the legal field or outside of it. But you're right. Like even regardless of, how you feel personally about the use of standardized tests for admissions and stuff like that, they do, they are correlated with performance in law school. I think there are also some studies about, how they're associated with cognitive ability and stuff like that too. So they're not like completely invalid indicators or anything like that. But you have to think about, all right, how bad do I want this? How much am I working at it? How many years has it been? What are the opportunity costs? What am I not doing in my pursuit of law school that I might be equally interested in, or maybe just under? But yeah, I mean, careers, Lee, you and I are, it's funny that you and I are talking about this, but we've gone to grad programs and we don't sort of practice exactly what we went to school for. Obviously, we use many of the skills that we developed by going to the programs we went to. But, we have, through our career process, taken a different path. And so, I think career often evolves and there might be opportunities you're not paying attention to or don't know about right now that you very well may end up pursuing and very well may enjoy just as much as you would the other thing that you initially set out to do.
I think that's a very interesting point. And I think, with law school, even more than other graduate programs, because you do have the bar exam as this kind of penultimate exam at the end, that your ability to take and study for these tests is just a necessary part of this process. Even if you choose to become a lawyer through an apprentice program, which is allowed in some of the states, including California, you still have to sit for the bar. There's no way to circumvent that. And I think that, it doesn't mean that if you, that the LSAT means, you do poorly in the LSAT, you won't pass the bar. But if you have a history of struggles with standardized tests and that testing itself is something that you don't want to prepare for or that you have struggles with, you either need to really dive in and try and figure out what's, could it be that you have learning differences that were undiagnosed? Could it be that you have, debilitating anxiety, testing anxiety? There can be those things that need to be dealt with, but you do need to realize that the test, this is not your last test of a significant nature that you're going to take. If you think the LSAT is bad, the bar is worse. So, I think there is just a realism about it. And I think that what you mentioned about looking at, lots of different jobs in the legal field is very interesting. I knew someone who was behind me in law school who was struggling academically, had some learning differences that were making law school exams and eventually the bar exam specifically very challenging. And so she ended up deciding that she was not going to pursue a law degree, but then she was going to become a court interpreter. Because she was bilingual. And so she went and did the training for that. And court interpreters are an incredibly important role in our legal system. And she was able to, go down that path, and they are good, solid jobs. They don't have enough court interpreters. And, but she still got to participate in the legal system. And in a lot of ways, she really had, individuals counting on her in a very specific way, which is also very powerful. And I think that in the end, that was probably the right choice for her rather than just beating her head against the wall over the bar exam for years and years and years. So, I think thinking outside the box and not necessarily thinking of some of these different choices as failures is hard to do, but it's a worthwhile exercise to do before you dump hundreds of thousands of dollars into this process of going to school.
Yeah. It's important to be flexible and to be open to different, possibilities. Even if you do pass the bar, right? What type of work do you want to practice? Do you want to be at a corporate law firm? Do you want to be in-house? Do you want to start your own thing? Do you want to do litigation? So there are always going to be decisions. It's not I did great on the LSAT, I passed the bar. Now I know exactly what path I'm going to go down for the next several decades. So, and that's also true, before getting into this whole thing.
Right.
So, yeah, lots of personal decisions to make, and I hope our discussion serves as a helpful framework for folks listening.
Yeah, and I think if you are at the beginning of this process, if you are thinking about going to law school, or if you're working on your application, I think talking to other people and making sure that you know what all the resources are available for you, or you can strategize, especially if you have a unique story leading into law school. I think that's where admissions consultants can really be helpful to help you frame, how you're going to apply to these schools, but also make sure that you know the resources that you can access and see if those resources are going to help you pass this milestone.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, unfortunately, we are running out of time, but can you share a little bit about how people can find more about you and your company, and if they wanted to talk to you about law school admissions?
Yeah, sure. The best way to reach out is through our website. There are contact forms and opportunities to schedule consultations to discuss your admissions process. I know Lee, you and I have discussed, maybe linking to some useful guides like what is the LSAT score that'll tell people a little bit more about what scores to aim for and how to think about the LSAT. I'll also talk to our team about writing something about the GRE versus the LSAT. I think that's a very useful resource for folks to have. But really, it'll be a pleasure to connect with anybody, and certainly it's been a pleasure talking with you again.
Awesome. Well, we will definitely link to those resources in the show notes and on our blog post. And I encourage students to reach out if they are interested in learning more.
Awesome.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes. I'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or Alison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.